Is reading over 100 books a year or more overconsumption? Yes, I regret to inform you that the current iteration of overconsumption discourse in bookish spaces is combined with the policing of how much people read a year. And if we take this argument in good faith, where I honestly believe a lot of them are born of, if not insecurity, then rage bait, which may be a conversation for a different day in terms of the attention that we give rage bait on a consistent basis. But if we consider this in good faith, I think it does open a door to conversations about reading life and the presentation of reading life online. Because remember, as I try to remind and circle back to as much as possible, the online bookish community is just a small fraction of readership. And there are many, many readers that never get online and post about their reading life, which honestly gives them time to read more books. But also segueing into conversations about the rise of rapid release and the pressures of rapid release, as well as some considerations around editing and developmental editing in the current landscape. And for the record, no, I do not believe reading 100 books a year or more is overconsumption, partly because I would be a big ol' hypocrite if I did, because as long as I have been tracking books and my reading life, which is back to 8th grade, I have consistently been reading 100 books or more a year. Now, in the direct inverse of a lot of people's recent anecdotal experience, the last couple of years have actually been lighter for me in that, or I'm just barely getting over that 100 books a year recently, which is more the kind of time commitment that it takes to be on YouTube, if nothing else, as well as the kind of brain drain of a full 9-to-5 workday and just scrolling, honestly, becoming more prevalent, which is something I am absolutely working on. But this has been something I have been consistently hitting since I was a preteen. But before we dive all the way into this conversation, hi, my name is Melody. We talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel. I haven't really dove into book community discourse recently, but I do have a lot of thoughts percolating. So if this conversation is of interest to you, I do have some other conversations potentially in the pipeline. Stay, hang out, share your thoughts. We talk about a lot of bookish things here, and I really strive to acknowledge and bring nuance into these conversations where it's not all either or, other than I really don't think we should be shaming people for how much they're reading. And if they're reading easier books than you, so be it. You should be fulfilled in your own reading life. At the same time, I do recognize the rise in anti-intellectualism and this kind of balking at good faith critique and toxic positivity within bookish spaces. But if we go back to this idea of how much we're reading in a year, 100 books or more a year, which is 2 to 3 books a week, which is how I saw at least one thread framed. And I do want to acknowledge that I am talking about this conversation as I've seen it kind of germinate and develop very broadly. I'm not trying to call anyone out specifically and or dogpile on anyone, because while I believe there are probably differing motivations for different people who are talking about this, I can't in good faith say I know what someone's motivation is in posting, and I don't want to dogpile on a singular moment. However, 2 to 3 books a week has been my kind of average speed as I've thought of it for most of my reading life, or my kind of litmus for how I think about my reading life when I consider myself in a slump, etc., etc. And a lot of this conversation kind of came on the back of some controversy regarding an influencer who I frankly do not know, potentially, seemingly, faking some reviews on NetGalley in order to get her percentage up on NetGalley. Now, NetGalley is its own beast. Many of you may know, if you've been here for a second, that I've just recently been dipping my toes back into NetGalley after their security breach of like 2023 or something, and I took that as kind of a sign from the universe to abandon that and just recenter my reading life, and so I wasn't beholden to that percentage, if nothing else, and also the kind of rat race of ARCs. And last fall, I kind of talked about stepping back from ARCs completely, and I've had some time to kind of recalibrate that a little bit, and you've heard me talk about ARCs more recently again, but I do think that it was really valuable to take that time away from ARCs. And especially with this conversation, I think we're seeing this again and again, this kind of status symbol associated with ARCs, because if you are unfamiliar with NetGalley, which is a service for requesting advanced reader copies of new titles in order to review for publishers, you have a percentage on your profile, which is basically how many of the advanced reader copies you have been granted access to you have actually reviewed. And this can be kind of dicey based on like when you want to post reviews, especially if you want to post them closer to publication date. And the longer you've been reviewing on the platform, the more that kind of stabilizes. But especially earlier, every review really counts. For instance, I just got back into the game and I think we are sitting at like a 30% response rate right now based on when some of these books are coming out and when I anticipate talking about them. And I think too, this kind of dovetails into a thought that I actually hadn't written down before now, but the kind of gamifying of things. And I think this is where we're seeing this kind of obsession from people with how many books other people are reading. Because one, it's more visible than ever, and two, it's hard not to kind of try to gauge yourself, or inadvertently even gauge yourself against what other people are doing or what other people are reading. And then we are seeing people judge others based on their own personal experience, which makes sense in some ways. You are coming at the world from your own particular point of view. This conversation is from my own particular point of view, which I would like to acknowledge very specifically here. But then we are seeing these kind of elements of judgment, which I think are inherently coming from some kind of insecurity or occasionally superiority complex. And I think the most malicious form of this critique I came across, I saw someone kind of equating or insinuating that people putting out 2 to 3 or more reviews a week are potentially either straight up lying, being disingenuous, or using AI to assist with reviews, because of course AI has been a big conversation point recently as well. So we're seeing the kind of culmination of all of these topics. But that is just straight out false. And it depends how people consider their reviews, how in depth they go, how much they edit their reviews. People are going to do all of that differently, and readers respond to reviews differently. So there's no inherent correct way to review either. It's not the more in-depth and analytical and specific you get, the more inherently true your review is. And I say this as someone who loves a clause and a phrase in my reviews and tends to overwrite in certain circumstances. And I do understand the frustration when we are looking at a landscape where it is obvious sometimes that there are people talking about books that are not going into any particular depth and may or may not have even read that book. And it feels like there's kind of an attempt to circle the wagons as bookish spaces online have become more popular. And I think as much as we kind of shy away from it, there have been people who have entered the space that are looking for an easy buck. And I'm not accusing anyone specifically. This is a very kind of casual conversation. And I also am excited and thrilled by the idea of people rediscovering their love of reading. And I have hopefully made that clear over the years as well, including when I first kind of touched on this conversation from the actual buying consideration part, when the idea of de-influencing first came into popularity or was kind of a trend. So I will link that here because that goes a little bit more in depth into some of those considerations, which we may circle back to here in context as well. But I think there is this effort to kind of try to police who is a real reader, which is very counterproductive. And some of this recently has kind of manifested in talking about how people are reading or how actively people are reading, or whether they're just skimming, or these accusations of just skimming, despite the fact that while it's not what I would do, and I really do balk against the idea of skimming versus reading, and I do believe you should be reading and not skipping huge chunks of text, and if you're only reading the dialogue, that you're not getting the full story, that the prose is very important. I think that that is all part of the conversation for sure, but at the same time, skimming a book is not a criminal offense. And I think sometimes a lot of this gets wrapped up or circles back to some of this ARC discourse and this idea of entitlement from some people, or who is more entitled to something within these spaces, whether it be respect and consideration, whether it be advanced reader copies and or PR packages, who deserves these things based on this. And this is where we see this real kind of obsession with other people's habits come into play. And obviously I think it is important to talk about a lot of these things on a macro scale as well. And I kind of held off talking about it recently because I just have been staying away from some of these conversations and afraid of not getting all of the nuance. And so I know that there will be nuance here that I miss, but we persevere. And so some of this idea of how actively people are reading, we see it come out as not remembering, or readers not remembering what they read, and that being some kind of indictment on how they are reading or how actively they are reading. I understand where that instinct is coming from. However, I currently, as someone who has been on Goodreads since 2007, so there's a lot of history and baggage there, because obviously Goodreads is its own kind of quagmire now. But if we're looking at this as kind of my longest standing reading record, I have read over 3,100 books since I started logging books on Goodreads. Now, when I joined in 2007, I tried to go back to my physical reading logs and add those back in, but I have realized over the years that some of that is not particularly accurate, especially in terms of like what year I read something within the 2000s in particular. I could not tell you the specifics of all of those 3,000 approximately books. And this brings me back to a conversation and an anecdote from, I want to say like 8th or 9th grade. I was in English class and we had our reading logs and our journals, and we had a sub one day, and this sub used to teach 7th and 8th grade English, and she was a good friend of my mom who is also a teacher in the school, so I called her Auntie Mary. And so she was looking at my reading log because we were doing self-selected reading that day, and she was kind of looking at everyone's logs. And she asked me straight out, Melody, do you remember all of these? Because I think at that point I had like 80 books for the year already or something. It was probably closer to the end of the year because that was kind of my average, was around 80 during the school year and around 20 over the summer was what I typically did. And I looked at her and I remember looking at her and being like, yeah, of course. And she was kind of shocked by it. And this is a woman who I considered like a very difficult teacher, and I never had her in class, unfortunately, but I know that she really would have challenged me. And so I remember being kind of baffled by that conversation. And then I got older and I started reading more, and I understood not only that, but my 5th grade teacher, who would go on to become a children's librarian after she retired at the same public library I worked at, who told us in 5th grade, before the advent of Goodreads, that she kept a physical notebook of the books that she read so that when she went to the library, she could check to see if she'd checked it out before. Or when I worked at the library, we had a patron who I would go through for her based on her checkout history to see if she had already read something. And so this is all reader behavior prior to the internet, and reader behavior that persists surely outside of the internet. So I went from like 8th or 9th grade and being baffled by the idea of not remembering everything I read to becoming a young adult, especially a young adult out of college, where I really started reading more voraciously because I had more time and I felt like I was catching up not only on classics at the time. I was really trying to actively read a lot of classics that I may have missed, even as I really did try to read a lot of classics in college in my free time, mostly because we didn't have a very robust popular library. But then I was also trying to catch up on books that came out in the interim while I was in college. And also I would anecdotally say that like 2013 and after, as we started seeing the rise of, especially book blogs were very popular and bookish social media really start to be a force, I had discovery that I had never really had before, and it felt like I had so many more options in terms of my reading. And let's put a pin in that. But it comes to the point where I can read something, I can enjoy it, I can be actively engaged with that book. I can write a review on it after, I can do a review video after, but 2, 3 years down the line, I may not as actively remember everything about that book. And some of that is the sheer amount that I've read, some of that is surely aging and other things that need to take up valuable mental real estate, but it doesn't mean I wasn't actively engaged with those books while I was reading them. For instance, I am currently, very slowly, admittedly, rereading The Buccaneers because season 2 is currently airing on Apple Plus and I want to be able to talk about it. Am I way behind where I thought I was going to be talking about it? Yes, but I talked about this book on its own the first time around. I also did a whole review on season 1 in context of the book. I actively highlighted and tabbed this book. I wrote notes on this book, and I still felt and feel like it's necessary to revisit in context or before starting season 2 so that I have a more immediate recollection and understanding of the text and context of the show. Does that mean I wasn't actively engaged with this book the first time I read it? Absolutely not. Does it mean I didn't like this book? Absolutely not. And in fact, that is some of how I have really considered rating too, prior even to like 2020 and the real boom of the book community on BookTok especially, and how that has kind of really shifted the landscape in a lot of ways, even more immediately than platforms like Bookstagram or BookTube. But even prior to that, I was thinking about the star rating scale, which, you know, on this platform I really don't talk about a whole lot in terms of my ratings, but I see a lot of conversation, like we all do, about what constitutes a bad review. And a lot of people seem to think a 3-star is a bad review. Again, there's a lot of toxic positivity kind of wrapped up in reviewing in the current moment. And again, because the idea of reviews is so wrapped up in marketing, I have a whole conversation about bad reviews as well. It may be worth it to revisit in terms of kind of the toxic positivity that has really ramped up from readers especially, but that is a really important and good conversation to revisit as well. However, I've always thought of 3 stars as kind of like, I enjoyed it, I had a good time, but I don't know necessarily that it's going to stay with me. And I don't go in expecting or looking for only 4 or 5-star reads in my reading experience, especially as I believe that a lot of books that are trying really interesting things or are being experimental with voice or form or what have you often end up being very divisive because of that. And so the rating or average rating will be lower. And so I think that there's something very valid in that spread of reviews. And it also goes back to why I am reading so voraciously. Obviously, I love to read and I love books, but I love discovering new voices. I love revisiting voices I know I love. And the market, especially with the rise of self-publishing, has more stories than ever right now. Though, of course, there is the caveat that there is always room for more stories, especially from marginalized authors who are still vastly underrepresented in publishing. And part of reading so voraciously is wanting to experience all of these stories or more of these stories, and reading these stories, reviewing these stories, buying these stories is a way to support the author. However, I also think that this kind of oversaturation in some cases, as well as the rising prevalence of the rapid release model, is also contributing to feeling these feelings of overconsumption and this kind of instinct to bulk and say, oh, we need to slow down in response. Additionally, because just, you know, by rules of numbers generally, when there are more stories being pushed out, the odds of running into more duds for you personally is just higher. And over the last couple of years especially, it feels like we've seen a real kind of ramp up in the publishing timeline and schedule, that it feels like traditional publishing is much more closely emulating the more rapid release schedule of Kindle Unlimited and KU subscription models, where authors are kind of forced by the algorithm to release very quickly in order to stay in that algorithm, relevant in that algorithm to stay in front of readers. And it's really hard because there are some writers that are absolutely capable of writing at this pace, and there are others that are not. And it's interesting because, what was it, 2019, we had the infamous Nora Roberts quote, "I have personally explained the process to you, Deborah." And as I had mentioned here before, it feels like that incident that looms so large in Romancelandia is almost obsolete now, because this all stems back to an argument on, you guessed it, a Facebook group for Nora Roberts, romance giant Nora Roberts, where a reader was upset that there was a year between the release of every book, which was a very standard at the time release schedule for a romance author, for a big romance author, and also was considered the kind of quicker release schedule in terms of genre fiction. Like a one release a year was considered pretty on par. Now, I also don't want to speak as if the current model has never been seen, or that authors have never published more than one book a year. I was actually thinking before I sat down to record of Jane Ann Krentz, who is another romance giant, and is top of mind especially because she was mentioned at the Sarah McLean event I went to the other night. But she wrote under 3 pen names, maybe still does, but especially during the 2000s when I was reading her most actively, she was writing under Jane Ann Krentz for her contemporary romantic thrillers. She was writing under Amanda Quick for her historical romances, also with a thriller or mystery component generally. And then she was writing under Jane Castle for her futuristic sci-fis, which I didn't read, but my library director always tried to win me over with the concept of the dust bunnies in that universe. So inevitably, surely there were times where she was releasing more than one title a year, yes, under different pen names, but still within the same year, and her readership knew that it was her. And when I was looking at fantastic fiction for kind of proof of this, which I didn't find in the way I expected, I did see in, I want to say 1982, she had like 3 or 4 releases listed for that year. And so thinking too of the kind of booms that happen around shifts in the industry. So romance, and especially mass market romance, I'm no historian by any means, but like the boom of that at that time and how much more accessible it was. And now we're at this kind of shift again where the mass market is dead essentially, and we are looking at this kind of subscription model. Like, yes, ebooks are prevalent, but it really feels like the industry and or Amazon specifically is trying to really funnel us in to this subscription-based model. And I'm kind of nervous about this, I'm not gonna lie, in terms of what it's normalizing for readers in terms of expectations, both in terms of release schedule and frequency, and also cost. But at the same time, there are only so many hours in a day for readers. But going back to the Nora Roberts of it all for just 1 second, this woman was basically trying to tell Nora Roberts that she didn't know what she was talking about in terms of the expectations, and trying to imply that the entire series should be finished and it should be handed off and it should be able to come out a couple of months apart, which especially some self-published authors were honestly probably doing even at that time, and that's probably where that expectation stemmed from. So it goes back to this kind of mismatch of expectations from different generations of reader. And in this case, not even generations, but just in how you have come up and what you've come to expect as a reader. And Nora Roberts, you know, was very gracious at first, and then this woman kept arguing with her. And finally she said, "I have personally explained the process to you, Deborah." And this idea of the time it takes to edit the book, especially. And I would like us definitely to return to the concept of editing the books in just a moment. But we are seeing, like I said, this real rise of rapid release, and this also kind of dovetails into the conundrum and concerns around AI in books in a way that is very immediate right now, as we have seen some real examples of AI being used in either the genesis of a book or straight up used to write a book. And this is kind of my nightmare as a reader, to potentially support or read an AI generated book and not realize it. I would like to believe I would immediately recognize it, but to be honest, there is some writing that just isn't good or developed even without the AI, and so I do wonder how refined my palette will be in being able to suss that out. And it's something that I am very nervous about and is obviously a concern for readers, and especially because we are in a climate right now where traditional publishers even are using self-published and KU as kind of their slush pile, essentially, for traditionally published, which is its own kind of quagmire of conversation in terms of what books are getting picked up then and what voices are centered and people support more broadly. Because ideally, self-published especially offers opportunities to voices, marginalized voices that aren't getting their proper due or representation in traditionally published spaces. But then these books are picked up at a significantly lower rate, I have no data to support this, just anecdotal evidence, than some of their peers. And again, I'm not trying to pearl clutch in a way that would insinuate that we've never seen the market kind of flooded with quicker, faster turnaround books, pulpier books, or that there's something inherently wrong with that on face value. Would I argue in favor of a kind of diversified reading experience? Sure. Where I am concerned is that it's starting to feel like the market outside of your kind of anomalies, especially within literary fiction, who can kind of go off for 5 to 7 years and come back with a new book, that the market is kind of starting to necessitate this. And because of this, we're seeing more and more titles, more and more frequently, in front of our faces, especially in bookish spaces online, in a way where it's sometimes hard not to feel overwhelmed by that. And that kind of contributes to this idea of overconsumption. And if we're going back to a couple of years ago, that kind of conversation that was had around whether BookTok was contributing to like the fast fashion of books. And from there, a lot of conversations can kind of fork off. But I also have to wonder if being more actively engaged in these conversations, seeing more and more titles online is contributing to this feeling, as it is undeniable that we are seeing this exponential growth of books and titles being put onto the market and authors trying to find their audience, which I will never deny is a feat, especially in this market, and is part of why I believe in supporting the authors and the stories that you care about by buying their books to show that you value those stories. And I'm saying this as someone who also very regularly utilizes my library, checks out books constantly, and that is a way to support these authors and stories as well. Reading, reviewing these books is a way to support these voices as well. I do want to emphasize that. But then the market starts to kind of snowball. And so then because of this, it feels like everything is kind of moving faster, even in an industry where on the traditional side, things are still years in the pipeline. However, I think this is helping contribute to a lot of underdeveloped books. And again, I'm not pretending that the current moment is the only time in which we've seen underdeveloped books or rushed books or genre fiction that is rushed through to meet the current moment and probably will not stand the test of time, because that is a tale as old as time. However, if we look at this in wake of 2020 and after, yes, we saw a real rise in readership and this revitalization of bookish spaces online as readership has really grown exponentially in a really exciting way. However, on the inverse of that, especially in the wake of the pandemic, we have seen a lot of industry professionals, especially editors, leaving the industry or being told to do more with less as they are hit with layoffs and wage stagnation, the same as a lot of industries. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently and over the years, and I also want to thank Sam from Thoughts on Tomes for having this conversation already in terms of specifically the editing and especially developmental edits. We've seen the editing kind of wane on both sides, copy editing and developmental, which both inhibit the reading experience in different ways. In terms of copy editing, we've probably all known that one grammar stickler that either marks up grammar errors in library books or tells you that they put the book down after 1 or 2 grammar errors. And I'm not gonna lie, I used to kind of roll my eyes at that. I still roll my eyes at the library books. Don't mark in the library books, especially because you may not even know the grammar specifically enough for what you're marking. But regardless, I have read some books in recent years that were severely under-edited just in terms of copy editing. And this is coming from someone who will overthink my grammar every time, even as someone who used to tutor in grammar. So I try to give a little bit of grace and recognize that I am not the expert on grammar rules, but sometimes it's glaringly obvious things like repeated words, incorrect words, unclosed dialogue, and especially from traditionally published books, this feels incredibly disrespectful to me as a reader, and not even to me as a reader, which it could be argued it is if I've spent money on something and it's so sloppily finished, but also to the author who wrote the book, and part of the deal of a traditionally published contract is those services. That being said, again, I do try to give a little bit of grace in the current moment where I know that a lot of these employees are overworked and underpaid, especially in light of a lot that we saw illuminated during the HarperCollins strike. But at the same time, why are we rushing so many titles if we can't sufficiently support so many titles, especially when, as someone who reads over 100 books a year, I am so buried in my TBR right now. I come on every month, and part of this is my own fault, right? But talking about 20 to 30 books every month that I have some semblance of an interest in reading, and they just keep coming. And so we have so many books fighting for our attention, and then some of these books end up being somewhat disappointing because of their potential, but their lack of an editorial hand, especially as Sam articulated in the developmental edit arena. And I do not have a history of being involved in editorial for books. I do have a history as an intern for a literary agent, and I did work and have worked as a dramaturg for plays and playwrights. And so I've been on the developmental side of plays. And usually this is asking a lot of questions of the playwright to kind of help guide what we're looking at. And I'm seeing a lot of this kind of lack of an editorial hand in books in like info dumping things, and not even show versus tell, which is kind of the more colloquial or popular way to explain it, but just that there's no emotional connection to the story. It's like we have this idea and we're just going to throw it on the page, but we're not going to really develop or flesh out the world in a really sustained way or interrogate the most interesting way to explore the story. And two, we've been having a lot of conversation about the tropification of fiction, and most specifically romance and contemporary romance, where I think we see this potentially the most egregiously, where things are not developed in a way where the stakes feel adequate. And I saw someone recently say that they think that miscommunication and third act breakups should not be a thing, which are very broad categories in romance, and there was a lot of agreeing in the comment section. And I kind of jumped in, and again, not trying to be contrary, but because I've had this struggle with myself and I'm kind of articulating this as well, and I had to go back and say, it's not that I dislike miscommunication or third act breakups. Yes, they're not my favorite, but I recognize that they're needed for conflict in a story. I don't like them, or have that instinct to say that I don't like them, when they're not well executed, when it doesn't feel justified within the construct of the story, within the characters as they've been built, or the character choices, where it just feels thrown in after. And I've had very engaged conversations about this, even within my romance book club with one of my best friends, Emily, who really also balks at the idea of miscommunication. And honestly, after this conversation I had in comments, I also went back to Emily to kind of talk this out, because I'm not approaching this from an antagonistic point of view. I want to be clear. But I also feel like this is more often a critique of contemporary romance. One, just because it's so prevalent right now, and it's what most romance readers are reading. And two, that a lot of the conflict in contemporary romances is internal versus external. And so there needs to be that moment of conflict, that moment where they choose each other and choose the happily ever after, because that moment of choice is incredibly important. And there needs to be a moment of crisis of some kind that forces them to make that choice. But what is it? Is it internal or external? And internal feels like the more logical choice within a contemporary framework, but it's so deceptively hard to execute in a realistic way, even as it feels obvious to say that yes, we are fallible as humans, we do miscommunicate, we do make assumptions, but sometimes in fiction we just see this pushed to the extreme. I would argue that sometimes this is not helped by a singular point of view, but sometimes I think this singular point of view is strategically being utilized in order to help kind of make this feel more reasonable. And so when it's not executed, of course it's going to be jarring. Or when you're reading a romance in particular, and for me, a lot of what draws me to a romance is that conflict and that emotional depth and exploring all of that. And when something feels very insta-love, and then it never develops past that, and it's all external kind of obstacles, but we never really feel like we know the characters any better, or the internal obstacles are just very thin in an effort to try to force these characters to do something. And this is where, you know, it becomes very obvious that while romance is an incredibly popular genre and really saturated right now, it is much, much harder to write than many people give it credit for. And I do think a lot of these frustrations are related to developmental edits, or fantasy worlds that don't feel particularly well developed, or contemporary literary fiction that feels very enamored of a style but doesn't get over the hump of what exactly it's exploring in the text through that style. I do feel like literary fiction suffers from this the least, as it's the least subject to these kind of expectations on how quickly books come out, but at the same time, some of it too is kind of necessitated by what the authors need to survive, because as much as we don't want to acknowledge it, this is a business, and it's a hard balance between the art and the business, because many authors are in this for the art, but you can't take away from the fact that they need to be writing for the market in some ways to survive, and that most authors, to be clear, are not surviving on their writing. But at the same time, I do kind of balk at some of these books that are churned out so quickly and feel so thin that they do feel like just a cash grab. And I won't lie, it's frustrating to see things that to me personally feel like a cash grab. And again, I recognize that is subjective, which is why I'm not going to name names. But when they get more attention than something that has more depth and is beautifully written and has a really interesting point of view, or something very interesting to say, or is just really fun in the way it's been developed, sure, that's frustrating. And I think some of that is the unspoken judgment inherent to this idea of people reading 100 books a year or more. There's some unspoken judgment, sometimes not unspoken, of what people are reading within those 100 books, or what people are reading to read so many books, and what people should be reading. And I want to be clear, I'm not here to dictate what you should be reading. I have historically read a lot of things that would have gotten me judged in the past, including historical romance that I had to put a book cover on in high school or tape an index card to the back in order to read before class without anyone seeing the step back art. And in a world so full of stories, do I think reading 100 books a year or more is overconsumption? No. Do I think that there's a lot more nuance to these conversations than we often allow? Yes. Now, to be fair, a lot of these conversations don't start with that nuance because they aren't meant to be a conversation, they're meant to be engagement bait. And honestly, I'm fascinated by the people that can consistently rage bait in bookish spaces, but the way that the book community responds to rage bait is a conversation for another day. In the meantime, I would love to hear your thoughts on this piece of the overconsumption puzzle. Again, there is a lot of nuance here, and I know I haven't touched all of the pieces as this is a more casual conversation, but I would love to hear your thoughts. And if you're interested in my thoughts regarding overconsumption and de-influencing in bookish spaces, definitely check out my other video as well. But thank you so much for hanging out and being interested in my thoughts today. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah, bye.